Riddle me this. Why is the most damaging drug the most readily available? Why can't you advertise cigarettes on TV, but you can advertise alcohol? Why do tobacco products have plain packaging, but not alcoholic beverages? And what exactly is the UK's drug policy based on? Now, in this video, we're going to be investigating these very urgent questions. Let's jump into it.
So a few years ago, I started to get interested in the relative harms of drugs. Why are some drugs legal, some drugs illegal? And we pulled together an expert panel, and we used this new technique called multi-criteria decision analysis. And that looked at all the kinds of harms that a drug can do, from whether it can kill you when you take it, to whether it actually causes environmental problems. We discovered there were 16 separate harms, and we ranked all the drugs on those harms, and then we weighted the harms. And amazingly, out of that, to my surprise, alcohol came top. Alcohol was the most harmful drug in the UK. And when you look at the reasons for that, you see it's because the social harms of alcohol are so enormous. The harms due to health costs, due to road traffic accidents, due to violence in the streets, domestic violence, those are the ones that make alcohol in the UK the most harmful drug.
Anybody who fools around with this, adult or minor, is playing with dynamite.
The drug laws do not reflect the science. They do not reflect the harms. Therefore, they are wrong, i.e. they're unjust. Promoting that statement to society was a necessary thing, because unjust laws are bad laws. What I discovered was that the government did not want that message. So as I was promoting this rational approach, the politicians were saying, hang on, this cuts right against the way we want to portray the world. And eventually they got irritated with me and sacked me.
Do you stand by what you said in 2009 that got you sacked?
Well, yeah, I do. And I think actually since then I've realized there's been greater problems as a result of some of the failure to be logical about drugs. It sort of implied that basically governments could do what they like with scientists. They don't like the evidence that scientists come up with. They get rid of the scientists, shoot the messenger.
We've just heard from the former chief drug advisor of the government. He presented them with information saying alcohol is the most dangerous drug, and he became a pest. He wasn't reading from the script, and they sacked him. So clearly, the UK's drug policy is not based on science, because it seems like the government follows the science only when it suits them. Let's rule out another aspect, which is common sense. We've seen what happened with prohibition, how it failed, Al Capone, alcohol. And there's another aspect that we can eliminate, which is harm reduction. You see, alcohol is allowed to be advertised. And Scotland, they proposed to decriminalize drugs. However, Westminster overruled them and immediately dismissed the Scottish government's calls to overhaul or devolve the legislation, because the government is maintaining its tough stance on drugs. So, what exactly is our drug policy based on? Well, let's follow the money, right? So one of the things we have to take into consideration is corporate interests, corporations, the alcohol lobbyists. Underlying the alcohol industry's policy agenda is the idea that responsibility for reducing alcohol-related harm lies with the individual drinker, rather than the industry or society more broadly. They emphasize the need for personal responsibility, arguing that the majority of drinkers consume alcohol in moderation. Consequently, policy interventions should be targeted at problem drinkers. So the alcohol lobby, they're trying to paint the problem as an individual problem instead of recognizing that they're actually peddling the most dangerous drug in Britain. Now, this sounds a bit familiar to me. We can easily exchange the words alcohol for tobacco. It is unsurprising that the policies advocated by alcohol industry actors differs from the policies advocated by public health practitioners. What is remarkable is that current UK alcohol policies are far closer to policies advocated by the alcohol industry than those indicated by the prevailing evidence base. This may reflect the government's overtly economic-based approach to regulation and concerns that falls in consumption levels may damage tax revenue or the nighttime economy. Extensive analyses of tobacco industry internal documents demonstrate that those companies have deployed a wide range of direct and indirect methods to influence policy at all levels of government. Tactics have included the use of contract lobbyists, campaign contributions to legislators and political parties, the provision of gifts, corporate hospitality, charitable donations, direct links with legislative and executive levels of government, alliances with other interest groups, the creation of CSR initiatives, and attempts to undermine the scientific evidence on tobacco and health. Now, the alcohol industry has strong similarities to the tobacco industry in terms of its global reach, the extensive financial resources, and the addictive nature of its products. Alcohol duty is supposed to increase each year in line with the retail price index. Instead, over the last 10 years, it has either been frozen or cut. This means that it has become increasingly affordable. Beer duty is 28% lower this year than it was in 2012. Now, this matters because when alcohol is more affordable, it increases the rates of alcohol-related harm. Reducing its affordability is one of the main mechanisms to reduce harmful consumption. As the World Health Organization, public advocates, and members in the House of Lords have said for years. So once upon a time, the US was a part of the British Empire, but it seems that the roles have reversed. Now the US says jump and Britain says how high. So the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act became federal law. And then the year after, in Britain, the Misuse of Drugs Act became law in 1971. And then months later, in that same year, the war on drugs was announced by Richard Nixon. So it looks like Britain is looking to the US for its cues. And whilst we're on the topic of politics, this is an important point because the actual definition of drug is politicized. So imagine this. In the House of Commons, they're debating the harms of drugs. They're plotting and they've actually succeeded in making cannabis a Class B drug. And then they go and celebrate their strong stance of drugs with a glass of wine. So the very nature, the very definition of a drug, the arbitrary categories is based on politics. Because if we're fighting a war on drugs, then how come the most dangerous drug has managed to elude that definition of a drug? Another angle is hypocrisy and inconsistency. So the UK is the world's biggest producer and exporter of legal cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. And what we find is there's an extremely high threshold when it comes to the legal use. It's always medical this and medical that, all right? But the question is, why is alcohol not held to the same standard? Now, if you remember Professor David Nutt, his analysis, it says the least dangerous drug was mushrooms. But even the least dangerous drugs, according to that scientific research, even that must pass through all sorts of hoops of medical benefits. And that's something that came with the Misuse of Drugs Act in Britain. They now started talking about psychoactive compounds. And that is where the politicization of the very word drug came into being. So let's take a look at what's happened with regards to tobacco, right? Because we're talking about hypocrisy and a lack of consistency. So in 1965, advertising of tobacco on TV ends in the UK. In 2000, media campaigns and services to help people quit. But then, significantly in 2003, billboards and print advertisements were prohibited. 2012, point-of-sale displays were removed in large shops. Small displays were removed in 2015. And then in 2017, all of the packs were standardized, plain packaging. However, when it comes to alcohol still being advertised on TVs, billboards, in the underground, on the tube. Alcoholic beverages still have wonderful packaging, and they're still extremely widely available. So it's not making sense, given the addictive properties, given the damage to society and the individual, why tobacco has been banned from television advertisements, but alcohol is still being advertised on TV. So then, this leaves us with the question, what is the way forward? Where do we go from here? So there's a couple of countries that I want to think about. One country, of course, Portugal, decriminalized the public and private use, acquisition, and possession of all drugs in 2000, adopting an approach focused on public health rather than public order priorities. But there's an even more radical intervention, which happened in Uruguay. So the president signed legislation to legalize recreational cannabis in December 2013, making Uruguay the first country in the modern era to legalize cannabis. In August 2014, Uruguay legalized growing up to 6 plants at home, as well as the formation of cannabis social clubs, a state-controlled marijuana dispensary regime, and the creation of a cannabis regulatory institute. Now So these are some things that might be emulated, but it needs the political will. It needs a party that will free itself from this notion of the war on drugs, to free itself from the shackles of US drug policy, and to understand that prohibition is not working, it's feeding into gangs and crime, and that perhaps a approach that is focused on personal freedoms, an approach that's focused on harm reduction, and an approach that's also backed by science, that might be the way forward. But I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. Thank you for watching. I hope you've taken something from this video. If so, like, share, and of course, please chime in with your comments. What do you think? Have I got this wrong, right? Do you have anything to add to the conversation? And I'll see you on the next one.